Hi, everyone. Welcome to a very special XpoNorth digital short. Today, we are celebrating the Christmas marketplace through XpoNorth, which runs through December 17th. And we have two incredibly special guests with some very interesting things to see today. We have Esther and we have Karen. Esther is an author, a knitter. Her book, This Golden Fleece, was published in 2019, and it's fabulous. And she's also wearing a phenomenal jumper that she made. I can't wait for you to see this. And then we have Karen from the Gairloch Museum, who's a curator and an archivist and also a knitter, and she's wearing a fabulous necklace and has some things to show us today. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
And let's start, I guess, Esther, let's start with you first, but can you both tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Yes, sure. So yes, I'm Esther, and I'm both a knitter and a writer. And I've been doing both since I was about 7. And in at the very end of 2017, I had actually been working in heritage for the 10 years before that. And I realized that I wanted to do some of my own research into things. And also that I was doing more and more knitting. Like I'd always done knitting, but I was doing more and more of it. And I was getting more and more interested. And so I decided to write a book that was a history of knitting and how we use wool in Britain. And I started at a museum because my father-in-law is the curator of the Wordsworth Museum in Grasmere. And there are these 2 gloves. Well, these are actually a replica of 2 Dentdale gloves. So it's stranded colorwork knitting. It's very fine gauge. It's 2-ply yarn on 2.25 millimeter needles. And these are a copy of a pair that were made in about 1924. And they're the last in a very long line of what were called Dentdale gloves. And they were made by the people who lived in the Yorkshire Dales, Yorkshire and Cumbrian Dales, for centuries as a way of supplementing their income. And so I found them fascinating to recreate, to go through that process of working out how they were made historically, using the same type of needles and the same type of wool, or very similar type. But as I was working through them and recreating them, I realized that I wasn't just telling the stories of the objects, that the objects were a gateway to the people who made them. And so I became fascinated in finding out more about, well, it wasn't just women actually who did knitting for income and for pleasure, and it never has been, but there was a large amount of women's social history that was brought up through that making the gloves was a gateway to. And really that set the tone for the rest of the book. So that was my first project. And then, I kind of went to different museums, and I was just amazed to find those kind of hidden stories of women who perhaps didn't leave a trace on history otherwise. People who weren't necessarily, even literate, but were phenomenally skillful and had a huge contribution, not only economically, but also socially to Britain.
So that's really powerful, because by kind of recreating those things, you're getting into their muscle memory as well, and recreating the actions that they would have done. That's really, I cannot wait to dive into that with you. Thank you very much. Karen, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm curator at Gairloch Museum. I've worked in museums for about 10 years, and I've been in Gairloch for 8, and I feel really lucky to work here. It's a beautiful place. It's a fantastic community. And as you perhaps know, we built a new museum a couple of years ago. So that was a really wonderful challenge to get our teeth into as well. And as you mentioned, I am a knitter, and there are a lot of things within our collection, and I'm interested in most of them. I'm particularly interested, I suppose, like Esther, in handmade objects. And because I have an interest in knitting, I do tend to gravitate to the textiles. And it's not just the knitting. We also have some wonderful hand-woven blankets in our collection as well, and lots of textiles that are handmade and from hand-spun and hand-dyed wool from all natural dyes, and just really special. And we've also got a very special knitting story in Gairloch, our Gairloch pattern, which is kind of unique in the Highlands and quite similar to the Sanka pattern, the gloves that Esther was showing. So a specific pattern that became the local pattern, and that started off as a way for people women in particular to make money during the destitution years, but continued and continues right through, and it's something that we at the museum have been working on. So I, for example, have tried to put a modern spin on the pattern. It was traditionally used for stockings, but they're quite difficult for people to knit, especially if they're beginners. So we've been trying to make the pattern more accessible, and we put together a knitting pattern for a headband, which is a much simpler knit, but still displays that beautiful pattern.
And can you, so, for the layman like me, can you distinguish between what makes it a Gairloch pattern for everyone? What in there makes it a Gairloch pattern?
Yes. So the technique that's used is a stranded colour work that Esther alluded to. Typically, stranded colour work has more than 2 colours, only ever 2 colours in one line, but usually more than 2 colours in the overall pattern. And Shetland knitting and Fair Isle knitting in particular are good examples of that. The Gairloch pattern only ever has 2 colours, and it's always this double diamond shape, with the 1-1 changing of the colors in between.
Just gonna poke. Can you make a little noise? Can you make a little noise so that the camera goes to you, Esther? Because you're holding up something.
Yes, I just holding up the example of the pattern here whilst Karen is talking, so that people can see what that looks like.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's the double diamond pattern with the 2 colors throughout. And sometimes you get little deviations, so you get little shapes like a stag's head or a cross inside the diamond, but it's always that diamond pattern, and it's quite distinctive.
Wow. So can I ask a little bit too? You both have brought up a similar theme about women as creators, this growing out of necessity, really. What does the pattern tell you about the person who made it?
So I'll go first if I may. So the pattern represents several things. So first of all, there's the bigger history. So in the case of the Gairloch stockings, the pattern is mimetic of the tartan, the kind of the shape of the woven tartan, and it's recreated in knitting because of the Dowager Lady Mckenzie, who was one of the landowning family around Gairloch in the 19th century, and she wanted to help the crofting communities to be better able to support themselves at the time of the destitution. And so she devised this pattern so that the women could create a product that she would then market to her wealthy friends and others. And so it has to have that kind of connection to the landscape in the tartan, but it also has to be distinctive and unique. And as Karen was saying, it's not found anywhere else in quite this way. So that's one way in which the pattern can tell us something about that particular person or people's history. But the other thing is that knitting, of course, is just a sort of palimpsest of the experience of that individual maker as well. And so something that I found on the gloves that I did to start with is that all of the gloves that were made in the Dales have a kind of identifying. They have these sort of unifying features, which is this diamond pattern and the 2-tone colouring and what's called midge and fly, this sort of flecked pattern on the inside of the palm. But they also have the name of the person who, not the person who made them, but the person for whom they were made, so the wearer. Really? And this reminds us, this tells us that connects us to the person who wore them, but it also reminds us that these were commercial. You know, this isn't someone knitting for pleasure. I'm not saying that the knitters didn't get pleasure from knitting, but it's primarily an economic function that they're meeting. You know, they're a need. This is coming out of need, and they didn't just knit, you know, like we do perhaps in front of the telly of an evening. They were knitting whilst they were out walking, whilst they were looking after the sheep, whilst they were taking the cows in to be milked. You know, it's a real kind of, it's a very, very agricultural product, and it's a product that's, because knitting is a fantastically flexible medium to work in, it's something that you can bring to wherever you're doing.
Wow. Esther, thank you. That's so interesting.
Yeah, I just add to that, you know, when I look at this pattern and when I'm knitting this pattern, I suppose I'm thinking about these ideas of memory, of sharing, of passing on the pattern. And the Gairloch pattern, it looks like a pretty straightforward pattern. I have knitted it many, many times, and I'm sure Esther will agree. It's not an easy pattern to memorize. And you know, it's quite, there's mathematics in there, there's geometry in there, and actually learning this pattern must have been quite challenging, I think. And I just love this idea of the pattern being passed down and you know, being an important skill, and also just wondering how the ladies who knitted it thought about it, because nowadays we have charts, we have computer programs that you know, that we can design standard color work charts, and they didn't have any of those things. They had maybe something to write on and something to write with if they were lucky. But
how did they on the
absolutely pattern? And that ties in with, sorry Jessica, I just want to pick up on that, like how did they learn, how did they kind of transmit this kind of knowledge and skill? And I found that so when I went to Shetland, I did a workshop with a designer and a long time kind of inherited knitter called Donna Smith. And she taught everyone how to make a Shetland lace shawl in miniature, so we could do it within a workshop. And she, you know, you start from the edge, and then you do a 7-stitch pattern around the edge, and then you work in, you do the sides, and then you join them up in the middle at the end. And there are no purl stitches, it is only knit stitches with yarn overs and knit togethers. Now, she learned this from her great aunt, Emma Isbister. And Emma is very old now, but she can knit without looking. And it's something that in Shetland, at least, and I think other places in the Highlands historically, that people learned to knit at such a young age, and when they were maybe 4 or 5 years old, and they started off with the really simple stuff. So they were given this easy back and forward bit to do in the middle of the scarves. So this was a whole community thing. And then as they got a bit more proficient, then, you know, their kind of manual dexterity was better, and they could memorize things as kind of longer pattern sections. They would be trusted with the next most fancy bit, and then the next most fancy bit. And so she, like, Donna has asked her aunt once to write down the pattern, and she couldn't do it. She could sit there and talk Donna through the pattern, and she could remember it. Like, her fingers had that incredible muscle memory. Like, but as soon as she tried to engage that kind of critical kind of part of her brain and try to explain it, then she just couldn't do it. So I think that that's a really important part of women being tradition bearers, is that it's because women don't often appear in the written record, they've got this huge repository of cultural knowledge. And I think it carries on today. Like, even though most people, you know, don't need to knit to support themselves, and, you know, only some people knit. If you think about how things are in a family at Christmas, for example, it's often mum, isn't it, or grandma, who gets the box of Christmas decorations out and puts them up, and who plans like the meal that you're going to have that's special around Christmas. And those memories shape that family specific sense of identity, but also that broader cultural identity of this is what we do. And so I think that without realizing it, women still are having that incredible tradition bearing role, particularly at these points of kind of social celebration.
That's right. I think that's so true. And, you know, there's something really profound. It looks so intimidating, the examples that you're holding up in terms of the amount of skill that goes in there. But, you know, Karen, we're going to give an example of the kind of make men do that really anyone can start if they're just beginners at this, that can get into. And I think you're wearing your purple gloves so that we can maybe see an example.
And can I just add to that? You know, when I published this Gairloch pattern headband just earlier in the year, I did a few workshops for people to show them how to do the various techniques to knit it. And I've now got various ladies, not just here in the community, but elsewhere, who are almost addicted to this pattern. And somebody came in last week for me with a beautiful Gairloch pattern cowl that they'd knitted. So they had adapted the pattern. And I just love that. You know, until 6 months ago, they had barely knitted. They certainly hadn't done any standard color work. So you can always learn. Yeah, so what I'm going to show you is, this is actually a Mckenzie tartan hand knitted sock from our collection. We do have the pair, but I'm just showing you the one. But you can see how wonderfully worn this has been.
Wow.
And it's got this lovely, I suppose I'd call it visible mending. It's darning, but it's not all in the one colour. And it looks like it's been darned many times and in different colours as well. And I think, you know, this is something that we were doing a little feature on during Climate Week, this idea of objects not just being thrown away whenever there was something wrong with them. And I know I have ladies in the museum who I've spoken to have said, oh, when the heel wore out in our socks, we used to cut the foot off and we'd pick up the stitches around the leg and we'd re-knit the heel and the foot. I think we're very quick to just put stuff in the landfill these days, but I'm really glad to see that things like visible mending and make, do and mend are coming back. And one of my colleagues in the museum here, she recently bought a pair of lovely, I think they're cashmere, really soft, fingerless gloves, but they came with a hole in them and they came with some yarn and a couple of little buttons to decorate it with and a little make, do and mend message on them. And I just thought that's lovely. Yeah.
That is lovely. You know, you're getting us thinking about how important I think knitting and these objects are in terms of thinking about women's history, especially in Scotland, think about heritage and intergenerational knowledge that's passed on. And it's also very green. You know, the idea that, I'm guessing, did the wool come locally?
Yes. Well, sorry. Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, I would say it almost certainly did. And, you know, it came locally. It was spun, hand spun and hand dyed. And I actually have a very beautiful suit in the museum here that came to us recently from wool that was grown on the person's croft. A lovely knitted suit. And, you know, that was not that long ago. It was 1950s. It actually was taken to Australia and sent back again because the lady died in Australia. So it's not entirely green in that sense, but it's very much of this place. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's that need or that desire to knit from a particular locale. Yes, there's that environmental benefit to it, which is really important. But there's also that kind of sense of coming from a place, you know, of it being really connected. So when I recreated the Gairloch stockings, for example, there isn't a spinner in Gairloch that's working commercially at the moment who's producing that particular weight of wool, the 4-ply that you would use for stockings. And so I still wanted to have yarn that was connected at least to the Highlands and Islands. And so the yarn that I used is actually the pale yarn is a 4-ply from Uist Wool, who are the mill that are based at Grimsey in North Uist. And then the dark wool is from Berlin yarns, again on the Hebrides, on Bernary, from sheep, you know, kind of heritage breed sheep. And so it connects, you know, not specifically with Gairloch, but it brings into that wider living and livelihoods of people that still live in those places now. And I think that's so important, particularly when we are talking about spending money on gifts, on hobbies, and about thinking, well, where is that money going? Not only is the product itself green, but are you benefiting sustainable business as well? And yeah, I was really pleased I could support places like Uist Wool and you know, the Berlin Yarn Company for that.
That's amazing. That's so amazing. And I think that's a good call to arms as any to look at like local crafts for your Christmas gifts this year, and things made by hand. So I'm so sorry to do this. I could talk to you both forever. It's so interesting and you're getting me want to start knitting. But we are running out of time and I'd love to ask each of you just one little bit of advice, something that you've learned along the way from your career, or something that someone's told you that you found becomes very precious as you are both going along your work.
I mentioned I only worked in museums for 10 years. You can see that you know, I'm not in the first flush of youth. I did have a previous career, and I had a sort of midlife career change, and I think it has been, it's made a world of difference to me. My life is just so much better. And I think my advice would be never be afraid to make major changes in your life because they can always be really exciting.
I love that. Thank you so much, Karen. I love that.
Yes, and I would echo that. Not only you know, don't be afraid to make changes, but be unashamed about your interests and passions, because knitting, you know, there's still, although it is getting much more popular among a broader demographic, there's still a real association with you know, kind of grannies in armchairs type of knitting, and you know, all power to them. That shouldn't be a negative association. But I just found it really interesting, and the more I got into it, the more I was interested. And so when you're thinking about like what you want to invest your time and energy into, like don't downplay your own passions, you know, get in there, find out about it, get stuck in, go to the archives. If you're interested in the history side of things, get out there and do things. Don't be afraid to get stuck in.
I love that too. I think both of those bits of advice are actually very symbiotic and go well with each other. Esther and Karen, thank you so much. I wish you both happy holidays and happy knitting. And thank you for joining XpoNorth Digital Shorts today.
Thank you.